Thank you. All right. Welcome to the 97th Governance and Risk meeting for MakerDAO. My name is LongForWisdom. I'm one of the governance facilitators. All right, so we're going to have a fairly short introduction this week. I'll just briefly go over the agenda, then we'll get started. So we've got governance at a glance from me. We've got a update on SourceCred from Seth. We've got Mariano from Smart Contracts talking about removing the last remnants of Psi from multicultural DAI. We've got Charles St. Louis, the MIP editor, giving a weekly MIPs update. We've got the governance facilitators doing the governance poll review as part of the monthly governance cycle. And then we've got Vishesh doing state of the peg. And we'll probably finish off with a general QA session like we usually do as well. Cool. So Rich, in the absence of you wanting to say anything, I think we will go on to governance at a glance. Right, so. Okay, yeah, so it's been moderately quiet this week on the forums. Not too many sort of very active discussions. We generally had a lot of kind of engagement with the threads discussing the liquidation system redesign, as you might expect. So we've had some good ideas coming from a number of people in that thread. And it's been great to see the Smart Contracts team kind of engaging as heavily as they are as well. So I'd encourage anyone that has ideas or just is interested in possible redesigns to read up on that. We had a couple of fairly recent threads. We had user Freezer, again, apologies if I'm doing that wrong, who talked about bounties and grants and possible ways to implement these, or possible some suggestions on what this could look like for MakerDAO, which was cool. We also just a few hours ago had Akiva post a premium discussion regarding sort of soft committing to keeping risk premiums and risk parameters in general static, like in the absence of like specific conditions changing, which I thought was an interesting discussion and thing to consider. Signaling wise, there's kind of been one main consistent signal this week. Nothing new's come up. There's a signal for adjusting the WBTC debt ceiling and risk premiums created by checkouts, which has attracted a lot of attention and votes, which is fantastic. I would sort of generally say if you haven't voted in this, then please do vote. And if you have voted, consider also voting for the leading option if you would find it acceptable, because we kind of want to get as much consensus as possible on the risk premium and the risk parameter changes here. Currently, 20 million debt ceiling is leading with like 52% of the votes. And then for the risk premium, 2% is leading with 47%. The second leading option is letting the risk team decide, so that'd be Cyrus, which is interesting. I think this might be a good time to let's take a brief moment to kind of discuss this a little bit. So if anybody has anything they want to say briefly, we could maybe spend like 5 or 10 minutes kind of discussing how this is going.
Yeah, I can kick off that conversation. Yeah, I think there's it's a bit of a complex situation with the debt ceiling. So yeah, I think as we all know, it's a little bit difficult to quantify the specific risks associated with wrapped Bitcoin. As far as I know, isn't really a good framework for evaluating this type of custodial centralization risk. Potentially not doable, or requires at the very least some legal opinions. And I think we've seen a few little bit of legal analysis from some of the community members, which has been awesome. But in general, it doesn't seem like something anybody is willing or capable of taking like pretty strong stand on. So what we can say though is like, what is the effects if things go very, very wrong? And the edge case here is that the entire debt ceiling has to be absorbed as bad debt into the system, similar to what we saw after Black Thursday with the 5 or so million DAI that had to be paid back. So you know, this is an issue that we have with wrapped Bitcoin, with USDC, and with any other future centralized collateral types that we might be putting into the system. That's kind of why there's at least some hesitation on my part to raise the debt ceiling. Additionally, you know, in terms of what are the benefits or what is kind of the incentive to raise it, we're obviously in a very low rate environment right now. All the stability fees are 0 or 1%. And there's a lot of different carry trades going on throughout the DeFi ecosystem, borrowing cheap somewhere and lending at a higher rate elsewhere. And I think it essentially amounts to a subsidy of sorts from MakerDAO to the community in the hopes of kind of continuing to keep the peg as close to $1 as possible. Personally, I think it'd be interesting to see what the wrapped Bitcoin demand would be if rates were higher, 5% or whatever, right? But I don't know when that's going to happen or when we're going to get there. So I just think we need like a very careful balancing of the trade-offs here. Like the pros for increasing the debt ceiling are obviously increased DAI supply, you know, increased performance of the peg or improvement of the peg, which despite the fact that it's close to $1, I think still needs a lot of supply to come in to kind of push it down below $1. You know, general increase in adoption and growth. I think market makers in particular would love to see the debt ceiling increase because it kind of allow them to kind of do these various trades in the DeFi ecosystem. But here are the downsides, right? We don't, you know, in the absence of anyone from the community to kind of come in and make a strong argument for why we should raise the debt ceiling from a perspective of centralization risk. I just don't know that it's such an automatic decision, right? With ETH, we have like a little bit of leeway where when we hit the cap, there's some leeway with raising it because the risks are at the very least constrained to just the price risks. There isn't kind of any of this additional credit risk that we have to worry about. So I guess just my minimum ask is that we're cognizant of how the risks for wrapped Bitcoin are different than for ETH. And that being said, if the community still wants to raise it, you know, I think that's totally fine. There's interesting ways to do it in a somewhat safer way. One idea would be to add a second wrapped Bitcoin vault, but with a higher liquidation ratio. So say like 175% or 200%, and then add another 10 million there, such that, you know, just a little bit extra buffer of protection in case anything goes wrong. The second option is to increase the current debt ceiling, but then also start to aggressively increase the stability fee on some sort of like almost like a utilization rate penalty. So you would increase the debt ceiling, say from 10 to 20, and then, every, and then increase the stability fee a few percent, and then if it gets to 15 million, another few percent, and so on. This doesn't really have the intended effect that we want, which is like protection from worst case losses or tail risks. But on average, it does provide a little bit additional compensation. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Would love to hear from other people on this.
Yep, feel free, anyone.
I feel like we should we got to get moving, right? We're getting KNC and ZRX on there. They'll help out. But other people taking bigger risks than us, Tether being the big compound, for us to increase by 10 million, and let's say we get a 4% on WBGC, I don't think we can actually increase that probably to 5-6%, maybe 7%, and people will still use that. I don't know. I think we should. The risk reward is. I think it's the chances of them defaulting are very, very small.
Yeah, I'll add to that. A big change for me in the last week was that WBTC.cafe went live, which is this like very easy way to sort of flip between WBTC to REN BTC and go straight back to BTC over the REN bridge. And I feel like that mitigates some of the concern I had around, what happens if there is a liquidation, are markets deep enough to sort of handle that? It's not perfect. There's not really enough REN BTC in the bridge to sort of handle everything that we already have in WBTC, but it certainly lessens my concerns, at least from liquidation's perspective.
Well, here's a question. So, I mean, if this is pure Bitcoin, just like no trustless bridge, nothing, right? If the ETH debt ceiling is, if we can agree that it's at least 100 million, then the Bitcoin one could also conceivably be, significantly higher than that. So does that mean the community is okay with one day having, say, 150 million of wrapped Bitcoin, right? So I think I agree that the risk is small, but the fact that it's not zero, they're somewhere in between, right? And yeah, if the community can maybe give some, that would be like a better signal request indicator in my mind. It's like,
yeah,
it's just like specifically that risk rather than like, oh, what do we think the debt ceiling should be?
Just for what it's worth, Cyrus, you're articulating that risk very well. I also think that all these things need to be balanced with your concern. Any BTC we get on Ethereum is not going to be as risk-free as just Ethereum. So, we're going to have that sort of calculation in there. I don't know if that means that Ethereum's are upper bound, or what. The decentralized bridges may get so good and baked in for so long that we can trust it more over time. But I think you're right to call out the centralization risk, and it's hard to quantify.
Yeah, and
we should charge them for the risk, right? We charge for the risk, right? If we're gonna take the risk and putting $20 million, let's say we get it to 30 million, right? And the default, we should be having our interest rates not at 1% where they are right now for WBTC, which is ridiculous. We should be up at like 7, 8, right? The overall market, centralized market, is at 10, 9, 10, depending what it is. So we should be at least where that is.
Right. So, I mean, but compensation for risk in the stability fee doesn't compensate for the exposure risk, right? So it's not that you could have, uncapped debt ceiling as long as you just increase the stability fee, because then kind of MakerDAO as a whole becomes susceptible to one collateral type. So the way I was thinking about it is that, like, if there's a plan to get dozens and dozens of collateral type or hundreds of collateral types into the system, then they're likely all to have somewhat smaller debt ceilings, right? So I think we could consider increasing the few that we have right now with kind of this implicit understanding that they'll go back down. As we add more collateral types, we'll start to reduce some of the existing collateral debt ceilings. Otherwise, I think we're just going to end up in the situation where we just balloon in exposure risk, and we just charge higher stability fees. But if even if we charge it something high, right? If we have a bad event, it could take down the whole system. That's what I'm concerned about.
So the stability fee, or let's say the risk premium, is really what we'd be talking about here. The risk premium for WBTC should help to build up that surplus buffer, which in theory, if the entire thing evaporated, would, we'd take a hit to the surplus buffer. And so over time, one can imagine that we build up a surplus buffer that is a sort of insulative layer. The problem is March 12th blew our surplus buffer. So, we've got to build it again. And so there, it's not an ideal situation, but while increasing the stability fee does not remove the risk of, the entire collateral disappearing, over time, it can help mitigate that so long as we have a wise surplus buffer that's like chasing overall die supply or something. But yeah, we're in a tricky situation. How do we get there from where we are?
Well, sorry to interrupt, but do we know if WBTC is covered by BitGo's insurance policy?
Yes.
Yes.
Share from BitGo, it is.
Oh, so then, and Kurash, while you're on here, is the 100 million for individual asset holders, or is it for the entire company?
Right. So it's $100 million per wallet. So each wallet is insured up to 100 million. So what will happen is, as if we're reaching 100 million, we wouldn't use one wallet. We would distribute it into multiple wallets. But if there is any reason which we should use a single wallet, which is not the case currently, there is a way for us to very cheaply increase the 100 million limit. So we would have to pay for it.
Well, so let me put it simply then, are vaults covered under the insurance policy?
Like the maker vaults?
Yeah, like any WPTC in Maker, if there was a theft from BitGo, is that covered by the insurance policy?
So the Bitcoin that we're custodying for the WBTC would be, yeah. But if something happens to the WBTC outside of our vaults, yeah,
totally.
That's not covered, yeah.
But so, Cyrus, to you, isn't that the risk we're trying to compensate for? So isn't this risk already insured?
Arguably, there's non-theft types of centralization risk too, right? Such as potential regulatory pressures that would render, insurance, right? I mean, again, so let me kind of reiterate, because I think LongForWisdom also wants to move on. My stance is that if this is kind of like the will of the community, and this will go through governance point whatsoever, it's workable. It gives me pause when the debt ceiling increase is appeared to be like something automatic, such as we do for the ETH ones. And I just want to highlight that there's additional class of risk here that is difficult to reason about, and that we should just be, we should also be conscious that being compensated through additional 5% stability fee does not, earning an extra 5% over, for the next 3 months does not compensate for when we have to absorb the entire, 20 million in a maker auction. That's all. If we can, agree to those, be aware of those, then sure.
I have a question about the quoted 10% figure for centralized borrowing. Am I right that that's for uncollateralized debt?
I think that 10% is just a random estimate somebody posted in the chat, right? That's not something that's not a hard rule that anybody.
I guess I just don't see why I think that 7 or 8% stability fee would be pretty steep compared to centralized services, because usually when you have collateralized debt, you're looking at between 3 and 5% rates right now, I think. But yeah, I question that figure, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what the 10% number is that you're referring to. So, but whoever.
That was me. Yes, he's right. So it'd be more like he's correct actually. So 3 to 5% would be correct, not 10.
Okay, cool. All right, I think we need to move on from this topic now, I'm afraid. As I said, we can come back to this at the end if people have more discussions they want to have around it. For now, though, Seth, are you here? Are you prepared to
Yep.
do your SourceCred thing? Do you need to share your screen?
Yeah, that would be great.
Cool. Rich, can you elevate Seth briefly? All right, you should be all good to go now. If anyone doesn't know, this is Seth_B on the forum. He works with SourceCred and is helping to coordinate the SourceCred trial that is currently going on.
Okay, can you see my screen?
I can only see a blank screen currently.
Oh, sorry, hold on, let me try again. Sorry about this, I was just sharing on the test, and now I seem to be having issues.
No worries. Do you want us to come back to you, or we can move on to one of the other segments?
Yeah, do you mind? I should be able to
No.
fix it here.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry about that.
It's all good. Mariano, are you good to discuss the SCI stuff on MCD?
Yes, I'll be really quick. So starting last month, after a single collateral DAI shutdown, we still need to do a little bit of housekeeping. This is just, a bit of smart contract work to, zero out some state in the smart contracts. And we've made this public. You can go to github.com/makerdao/spells, and there you will see, let me see if I have it. Yeah. I think we discussed in the forums that everybody was okay with this. So my idea is to put it up for a vote tomorrow, along with whatever else needs to happen with the executive, which, if I understand correctly, there's, I don't know if there's nothing to do, but I would like to get the go-ahead to do this.
Yeah, I think that's fine. We discussed it in the in that forum thread, and I don't think there was anybody no one seemed to object strongly.
Cool.
So
This is just some housekeeping. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Seeing as this is just like kind of an administrative change, I think it's probably fine. If for whatever reason makeholders are strongly opposed to it, they can vote it down. So it's mainly kind of just informing people that it will be in the next executive, so they're not surprised, I guess.
Cool. Yep, that's it.
Okay, awesome. Seth, are you good to go, or I need to try again?
Yeah, let me try real quick here.
Sure.
Can you see my screen?
No, it's just getting a black screen. Is everyone else seeing that as well, or because it could just be me?
Yeah, it's a black screen on my side.
Oh, hang on, there we go.
Wait,
Yeah,
hold on. Yeah.
Yeah, we got something now. Cool.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So what you're seeing right now is an instance of SourceCred, which is a open source protocol for valuing, measuring, and rewarding open source contributions. SourceCred is doing a trial with MakerDAO where we are scoring contributions on the Maker forum, and the foundation is distributing right now $5,000 worth of DAI according to cred scores. So $1,250 a week now. Every Monday we are posting, let's see if we can get it up on the screen, the cred scores for the week and DAI distributions. And my computer seems to be just sort of seizing up. I think that's the issue, so sorry about that. So here we can see some scores, and if anyone has any kind of like ideas or questions about how this data is presented, please let me know. That is something that we can evolve. And to just go back to the instance here, I'll just give a quick tour of the UI here, but also let you know that SourceCred is actually undergoing a redesign of the UI right now, and there's going to be something much better here in the next week or two, so I won't spend too much time on this, but here we can see cred scores over time, and the default is by users, but you can also go in and sort by topic or post. And you can also look at the post that got the most cred for a given week. And since my screen is being really kind of scrolly, I won't go into that too much. You can actually go in and change the default weights of the system though, which I can link to some documentation on how to do that as well.
Yeah, I just say like personally, like I found like messing with the weights of the algorithm pretty interesting, just to kind of see how it affects cred scores generally. There's like a whole list of sliders to sort of control how much cred flows from different nodes. So like how much cred flows from like a topic to the person who made the topic, from people that like things to the thing they liked and all this sort of stuff. So it's quite interesting to kind of look at the default weights that are being used and kind of fiddle with them and potentially see if you can figure out like a better configuration for the weights that leads to a more like to a sort of cred distribution that you think better matches like people's contributions.
Absolutely, yeah. And we put some thought in, a considerable amount of thought into the default weights, and we think it works well out of the box, but there are certainly better configurations for Maker. So I encourage everyone to play with the weights, and if you find a configuration that just gives a better reflection of reality, just let us know. We're totally open to tweaking them to optimize them. Okay, so right here I have a chart of the total cred. So here's some observations from the trial. Here's a chart of the overall cred over time for the whole lifetime of the forum. And as you can see, this week is dropping off here, as Long was alluding to in the beginning here, which is not surprising because this peak here is basically Black Thursday and all the activity around that. And so I'm expecting this to sort of bottom out and then form a baseline, which we can use to like more accurately measure the effect of SourceCred. And the main metric we are looking to optimize for is engagement on the forums, getting more people to engage by paying them. Some observations from the first 2.5 weeks that the trial's been going. First of all, no overt gaming, which was great to see. Not terribly surprising because the maker community is relatively small and high trust. And we will definitely be vigilantly monitoring for gaming, but none so far. We have 13 opt-ins. Also a reminder that you do need to opt into the trial. I will post a link to a post with instructions on how to opt in. Basically, you just need to email me and Ethereum address to send that to. We are seeing a few interesting little corner cases that we didn't see internally in SourceCred. For instance, some scores are artificially high because basically like a quirk where if a contributor comes in and contributes a lot of value and then disappears without liking or engaging with other content, cred sort of gets trapped in that person's node, and they have an artificially high score. We don't see that as terribly problematic because there's not too much money being diverted from that, and we also have a refactor of the algorithm in process, which is going to fix that problem, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I'll just finish with a brief roadmap of what SourceCred is up to. As I mentioned, we have a new UI in progress, which should be a lot better than what we have right now. It will, for instance, allow you to drill down into any contribution and see where that contribution got its cred from, like similarly with users. That should allow us to like better understand cred flows and also to debug or detect gaming if it's going on. SourceCred is complicated, and we know that, and we're working on better documentation so that people can better understand how SourceCred works. If anyone has any questions, though, please don't hesitate to ask me on the forums. I'm happy to answer questions and point people in the right direction. We're working on some data visualization analysis, which will take the form of tools that we can provide the maker community, and I'm also planning to start doing a little bit of that analysis and posting the results in the forum. So if anyone has any sort of data analysis or data viz ideas, I'm all ears. And then, as I mentioned before, we're doing a refactor of the algorithm, which is called cred rank. And this won't actually change the basic scores or anything. It's more just an optimization that will give us more flexibility. It will get rid of our little problem with cred sinks and allow us to do more data analysis. It will make the algorithm run faster, et cetera. And then, of course, there's like a lot more going on in SourceCred that I don't want to spend everyone's time going into here. Oh, and also some maker customizations. One thing that I've been talking to Long about doing is potentially minting cred based on trust levels in discourse, which would allow us to prevent certain types of gaming and give us a little bit more Sybil resistance. It could also prevent people from getting cred, for instance, for showing up, just to like show their coin to get accepted to MakerDAO. And even if it doesn't get accepted, they get cred, right? We want to avoid that. We're also looking at the possibility of minting cred based on categories or tags, which would give us a lot of flexibility to incentivize specific things. For instance, activity in a category, potentially incentivize certain governance actions, which is pretty exciting. And we're looking to experiment with that in the coming weeks. Yeah, and just finally, engaging SourceCred. Feel free to ask me questions on the forum. I'm here anytime. Here's a link to our Discord, and we actually have created a MakerDAO chat channel just with maker-specific stuff. If you want to just dig deeper or ask questions directly to the team. There's our website, And we also have a community call every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time on our Discord. And that's a great place for anyone to drop in and just learn more about SourceCred, ask any questions you might have around the trial or anything. I guess that's about all I have. Long, is there time for questions or?
Yeah, we can spend a brief sort of a few minutes on questions now. We had a couple on the sidebar while you're talking. Andrew Dawson asked, is there a plot of the distribution of the weekly disbursements? Which I guess, yeah, I don't know exactly what he meant by that, to be honest, but
I think I know what he means.
Sure.
There isn't currently, all that we're doing right now is publishing an observable notebook, which just lists the scores, but I can definitely create a little chart of the die distributions or scores over time. And if you're just looking to look at the scores, that is in the current UI. You can see that.
Cool. Then that's another question, which was, who is responsible in determining the incentivization structure for the forum engagement via SourceCred, e.g. tags, actions, content? Which is possibly a question for me, because the answer is essentially me and Rich and the SourceCred team generally at this stage. We're in the trial stage, we're kind of interested in trying out different things and figuring out what could potentially be viable. In terms of like what long-term we would want to incentivize, in terms of like specific tags or types of content, that would be something that would need to be decided by wherever the funds for incentivization came from, which ultimately, if everything goes well, should be the protocol. So ideally, it should be the community deciding what specific things are incentivized, whether that's like discussion around MIPs or engagement with kind of like risk reports from like Cyrus's team, or smart contracts things and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, just to follow on a bit, the first month is prototyping and testing it out and looking for red flags. But at least my personal hope is that the community engages with SourceCred and the team directly to determine for themselves what activities they think is beneficial for the ecosystem. So part of why I find this experiment so compelling is that we'll be able to directly interact with the community to figure out what kind of activities the community wants to incentivize as well. So that's why we're extremely interested in having anybody who has some thoughts to engage with us in the forum thread and help us shape the experiment.
Yep. Okay, I think we should probably move on to the next agenda item, which I believe is Charles giving us some MIP updates, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's me. I think, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll get right to it. So in terms of this week's activity in the world of MIPS, the monthly MIPS governance poll was submitted for the 6 proposals that passed the inclusion poll stage. This includes 4 amendment MIPs to change MIP 8, 9, 12, and 6, a risk team onboarding proposal, and the declarations of intent. So, additionally, there were also 4 polls that went out for whitelisting oracles. These proposals were for DeFi Saver on the ETH-USD oracle, a whitelist for DeFi Saver on the BAT-USD, DeFi Saver on Wrap Bitcoin USD, and an MC DEX on ETH-USD oracle. Lastly, there were 8 polls that went out for appointing and proposing new light feeds. More specifically, it was for Kyber, Infura, Etherscan, and Gitcoin. If Nick is here, he might want to add some details as to what these polls entail and what the next steps are for those polls if they all passed the governance poll. So if not, I'll be sure to include it in the weekly MIPS update forum post, but if Nick is here and wants to shed some light, now's the opportunity.
Yeah, sure. So The next steps are basically for the whitelist that they just get bundled in the in an executive vote, right? Because we just need to make a change in the whitelist, right, to add them in. For the light feeds, there's a little bit of a longer process because we now need to basically have all of the projects that got voted in to have them set up and configure their feed. So that process will probably take maybe just under 2 weeks. So we'll probably get started with that this weekend. And then they too would also be bundled up in an executive vote.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, wait, when would that executive vote be held for the current governance polls?
I believe on the 26th. So it's not the next one, but the following one.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks, Nick. So in terms of Thursday today, we're going to do the governance facilitator review of the polls that passed. The MIPS governance poll passed with 0 votes, so it will proceed if the governance facilitators confirm yes on the outcome, and that vote would go out on the next Monday. So I do want to note that the executive votes for MIPS do have an expiration of 4 days, after which it would have no effect. So the proposals would only move to the accepted status if the executive vote is included and passed within that 4-day limit. And if the executive vote fails to pass within that limit, the proposals would have been officially rejected. Next Thursday, the governance facilitators will perform the governance cycle review as part of this meeting and summarize and discuss the past governance cycle with everyone on the call. The meeting is also an opportunity to discuss the upcoming governance cycle and any potential submissions for July's governance cycle. So just a note about the July cycle. So even though it is a couple weeks away, I do want to note that the formal submission period does end on July 8th. So if you do have any proposals in progress, submitting them for review sooner rather than later is definitely a good idea. In other news, in terms of collateral onboarding, there were 2 governance polls to onboard KNC and Xerox, and they have both passed. So they will proceed to an executive vote at the end of the month on Friday the 26th, along with the other polls that Nick mentioned. The next community greenlight polls will go out next Monday on June 22nd, in the final week of this governance cycle. And I do want to note again that if the amendment MIPs pass this month, the community greenlight polls will start on the 3rd week of the governance cycle, ending at the end of the governance cycle instead of carrying over to the following month like it is currently. So in terms of new activity in the MIPS forum subcategories, the proposal idea category was created last week. So this is a place where you can propose your ideas for improving the Maker protocol, technical, governance related, or whatever. The first post in there was the pre-MIP discussion for the redesign of the Maker protocol liquidation system, and the discussion is still going very strong. And again, I do encourage everyone here to take a look when you have the time. And now there are 3 other posts in the proposal category, which is awesome to see. The other proposals are soft locks and future guidance. I believe it was by Akiva, and a post about bounties, which Long mentioned briefly at the beginning of the call, which could potentially work well with MIP 13 if that does pass. And the last one was a decentralized maker broker. So if any of the authors are here and they want to mention something briefly about the post, or just I can direct them to the forums in the weekly MIPS update. I think I saw Akiva here, so if he wants to say something briefly, now's a chance.
Hi guys. Yeah. So this new MIP, this pre-MIP discussion, it can go alongside some of the rate hedging mechanisms to provide more predictable financing agreements with MakerDAO, and that may help scale the DAI supply. That's the motivation behind it.
Awesome. If you want to link to the forum post in the chat, that'd be awesome. So the last little update was with respect to the subcategory for polls and votes. I created a read-only category that's dedicated to providing more awareness and notification of what's going on during the MIPS governance cycle in terms of voting. So it will be that go-to place to see the active either inclusion polls, governance polls, or the exec that are all related to MIPS. So right now it has the governance poll within there. And as of Monday, I'll update it for the executive vote. That concludes the update today.
All right, thank you, Charles. One thing I'd just like to highlight is that this month's, like the June's governance cycle, finishes on the the Sunday is the 28th of June. There's then like 1 week where we don't really do any MIPS governance cycle things, because MIP 3 specifically states that the cycle starts on the first Monday of the month. The first Monday of July is the 6th. So we have like a week's break where we don't need to do MIPS-y things, which I just thought I'd highlight. Cool, okay. With that then, facilitators will do the governance poll review. So just looking at the governance poll for the MIP cycle, the MIP monthly cycle. So as Charles said, this included MIP 13, declarations of intent. It included 4 amendments, amending MIP 6, MIP 8, MIP 9, MIP 12, and included a sub-proposal to ratify Cyrus as a official risk team. So the poll passed with like 3.7k MKR with 12 unique voters. So this is, I'm not sure if this is less than what we had last week, but there was no maker voted against it. So I don't see any reason to prevent this from proceeding to the executive. Rich, do you want to give your thoughts?
No, I'm comfortable with you speaking for the team.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, so they'll continue. So the executive Charles mentioned will be live. Is it next Monday? I think it's the next.
Yeah, it's on Monday.
Yeah, next Monday. That's correct. Cool. Right. Good. All right. What else have we got on the agenda?
I mean, so did I hear you correctly? Did you say 3.7K, like 3,800 MKR?
Yeah, 3,700 MKR total. Vote on that, 12 voters. I'm assuming we're seeing fewer voters vote on this, I think, because A, gas prices are high, and B, because the kind of monthly cycle requires you to vote on the same thing like 3 times. And this is the middle vote. So I'm not terribly surprised that it's not attracting a huge amount of participation. I would still encourage people to vote no, obviously, but yeah. Cool, right. Okay, so I believe the last thing on the agenda is Vishesh's State of the Peg before we move on to a Q&A. Vishesh, are you good to go? Rich, do you want to elevate Vishesh?
Yeah, good.
Cool.
I just need the. Oh, there
yeah,
you go.
yeah,
Yep.
okay, he's getting there.
All right. I know we've had a lot in this meeting, so I'll try not to take too long. All right. So in general, the DAI supply is pretty stagnant since the previous week. So total DAI is at 118 million. DAI from ETH, 106 million. DAI from BAT, 500,000. DAI from WBTC is still just near capped out. DAI from USDC is around 1.7 million. So let's double click on those in a moment. But in terms of DAI price, so essentially what we saw in the past week or so was a bit of a dip and fluctuation in ETH price. Again, these are not particularly large margins. That's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, DAI price did sort of rise as the ETH price began to fall.
which is, a pretty consistent trend. I think DAI had sort of, in the last month or so, snapped back into that tight negative correlation. And basically, as ETH got cheaper and cheaper, what we kind of saw was a decent proportion of ETH DAI trading above $1. And so basically those ETH DAI trades spiked up initially as ETH price was falling most rapidly, and then sort of evened out, which is a pretty consistent trend from what we usually see. And then the ETH price had started to recover a bit of that dip, and then the DAI price started to come back down a bit. So it's just basically type fluctuations. Although this kind of marks, over the last few weeks, basically a bit more increased ETH volatility. And with the ETH price being cheaper now than it was, say, a week ago, that DAI price is still a little bit elevated. And so the reasons for that, ETH being a bit cheaper now, I think produces a bit of hesitancy in DAI holders to basically increase leverage, and that's been a pretty historically consistent trend. If people are unsure what ETH is going to do, they're less likely to lever up, and so they're less likely to relinquish that DAI. So what I think will happen is if ETH price recovers further, then you would see this even out. But basically, for the past few days, DAI has maintained a bit of an elevated price at around $1.01, $1.02. So just to touch on real quick from a centralized order book perspective, basically what we see is the USDC DAI trading has leveled around $1.08, and so that's a pretty small buffer above $1 and a bit better than what the ETH DAI trading had indicated. Presumably because there's just a very, very slightly larger spread on ETH DAI right now than there is on DAI USDC. So just to touch on a couple of the other collateral assets first. So USDC DAI is pretty much flat at this low, like 1.7, 1.8, 1.9 million level. BAT is has maintained that historical 500,000 or so. It's a slight increase over where it was in March, but obviously that's a big drop off of where it was prior. WBTC, so what we essentially see is that's kind of kept at that cap effectively. And I know that's a thread that's already being discussed. In terms of ETH, so what we essentially saw was after that initial 10 million that somebody had put in, taken out, and then we saw a bit of a dip in supply. That dip was, went as low as 102 million and is potentially starting to recover. So, you do tend to see these sort of minor fluctuations along the way, but there's no reason to think at this point that it's not maintaining that sort of overall growth trend. We'd have to wait and see a bit, but there's no indicator that that anything has fundamentally changed in what's been going on with ETH DAI. So all in all, it's pretty quiet. I mean, there were a couple of short-term fluctuations, but nothing that yet appears to amount to like a long-term trend. I will pause there and see if there's any questions.
I don't think there's been any questions, but Joker commented that's Compound effectively have negative rates at the moment, considering the comp distribution thing.
Right.
So potentially that's people are choosing to lever up on Compound rather than maker because the rates are like negative compared to 0?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a whole other thread about what's been going on with secondary lending markets. I just realized I stopped screen sharing anyway. But I was just pulling up the compound markets page. Anyone can take a look at that. Yeah, essentially what we tend to see with the secondary lending markets is, you know, there's a tight relationship in terms of the relative spread between the rates and effectively what people refinance to and from. Although I do think that what's been going on with the comp token distribution lately can potentially befuddle what some of the numbers are. So that probably needs to even out a bit as well. But yeah, if there aren't any other questions, I'll just pass it back or to control back.
Yeah, can do. I think you're the last on the agenda, so we can
Okay.
open it up to questions generally. Does anybody want to ask about anything that's come up so far? We can potentially bring back the WBTC discussion if people have more things they want to say about it.
I just wonder, before we do that, you know, last week Nick had talked about potentially pushing through some of the Oracle stuff in the weekly governance cycle. Is that the reason that these Oracle votes were polling now, or was the poll because we've decided to go with the sort of more traditional MIPS process?
So the poll was why we ended up putting them up this week. So essentially, there are just a few inconsistencies in kind of MIP 10 that we need to fix, and just in the interim while we refactor those, that's when we want to kind of use this this short cycle.
Cool, thanks. It's really awesome to see that stuff going through. There's some really fantastic proposals there that are very exciting. So big props for that, man.
If you like that, there's a lot more that are on the way. So you know, getting more light feeds on board is a big priority, at least for me personally, but I think should be for the community as well, because it just further kind of decentralizes our oracles. It makes them more robust, more resilient, and it also makes them a more attractive product for external third parties as well. So we're going to see a lot more whitelisting proposals as well.
Yeah, and on that point, just bouncing off, I think that it's well worth sort of reading particularly Ruin's response in the question about the liquidation process, because he consistently points people to MIP1 and this notion of problem spaces, you know, because there's been some debate about the edge case of the OSM failure in the liquidation process. And if we have an OSM failure, then we potentially have bigger problems than our liquidation process. And having a look at MIP1 and understanding intimately what the problem spaces that we face as a governance community are, I feel is quite an important thing for the community at large to kind of keep front of mind, because there's some, you know, genuinely interesting stuff in there that's could lead to, you know, fruitful discussions on these calls as well, particularly in this kind of question and answer session.
Yeah, definitely couldn't agree more.
Yeah, if anyone hasn't looked through MIP1, just to like browse, I would, you know, again encourage people to just look through, because it's kind of the closest thing to like it's not like to like a roadmap, I guess, that we have at this stage in terms of what the foundation wants to complete, I guess, before it dissolves. So yeah.
I thought roadmap was a swear word long.
Anyone else got anything they want to bring up, discuss?
Oh, Nick, there was a question for you. Will asked, do you have a list of the lighted oracles anywhere on GitHub or the forum threads?
Oh, sorry, it's light feed.
Yeah, light feed.
So I just posted a link to the GitHub MIPs repo. And so we have in MIP 10, there's a component 17 MIP that just lists out all of the feeds. Basically, I would have to update this to include the results of this week's polls. But if currently we should be at 24 total.
I have a question about scaling the oracles. So currently, as we're adding more collateral and we're also adding more oracles, it seems like it may be, this is sort of like a quadratically increasing function in the function of those two components. So I'm just, I'm curious about like thoughts about how to scale up to that massive number potentially in the near future.
I mean, you'll have to elaborate on what you mean by scalability, right? Is it scalability in the number of fees, scalability in the number of actual oracles, the number of customers? Is it kind of performance scalability? What are you interested in?
I'm looking at the feeds. So the feeds scale up with both respect to the number of Oracle providers as well as the number of collaterals that need feeds. So that looks to me like sort of since both numbers are going up, that looks to be like a quadratically scaling sort of number, which concerns me.
Okay. I mean, so in terms of the number of feeds, I mean, there are diminishing returns at one point, right? So yes, adding more feeds provides, you know, more kind of security in theory, right? But there's also costs, right? So we pay a feed like 1,000 DAI per month, right, to kind of cover their expenses and to cover kind of the developer hours in terms of maintenance and monitoring. Personally, I think kind of we're aiming, at least in the short to medium term, for this kind of a 30 number. Not that there's really a science to it, but the idea of having an equal number of dark feeds to light feeds seems very attractive, because then, you know, even if all of the dark feeds were civil, for instance, they wouldn't actually be able to come to a consensus on any price, right? Same with, you know, if there was some kind of, you know, social media campaign and turn of sentiment against Maker or something like that, even if all of the light feeds, right, came to consensus to screw over Maker, right, they wouldn't be able to change the price either. So that seems like an attractive kind of position to be in. So that it's kind of where I'm trying to push for at the moment. But at the same time, you know, we shouldn't be adding just anyone, right? We don't want to add low quality partners. You know, we do want to just get like the biggest players in the ecosystem. So if we have to be a little bit patient to get those types of projects, then you know, we should evaluate those trade-offs, right? In terms of the actual oracles themselves, right, in terms of customers, I think that now that we have these governance processes in place, everything is going to kind of go much quicker now, right? Now that we have kind of the monthly governance cycle, right, and there's specific dates by which things need to happen, right? And doing these in parallel can actually be quite rapid from a development perspective. It's only when you have to do them kind of one by one by one by one that you're incurring, I guess, like the largest time penalty, right? It's not any more effort to whitelist, you know, 8 people in one proposal than it is to whitelist 1 person. I'm quite encouraged by the fact that the governance stuff has been going smoothly until now, and I kind of just think that we're gonna fall into like a good rhythm the more and more we do this.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're wanting to like sort of get up to about 30 dark feeds, 30 light feeds ish, and kind of leave it there and not continually increase it ad infinitum.
Combined. So we're at 15 dark feeds.
Oh, 30 total.
Yeah, 30 total.
Okay, but I'm saying you don't want to keep going up, right? Like there is some sort of secure enough number that we don't want to like go too far past it just due to cost.
Yeah, I don't presume to know that that number is 30. I think that's a decision that the community needs to weigh in on. But it seems like a good starting point considering that we have 15 dark feeds, right? So at a minimum, matching that and having a total of 30 feeds seems like a good number to stop at before we then reconsider, okay, do we want to add more, right? And if we do want to add more, what is kind of the proportion here? Do we just exclusively want to add light feeds, or do we want to keep this kind of 1-to-1 ratio of dark to light, right? You know, even adding dark feeds is something a little bit complicated, right? Because the whole point is that they're anonymous. So it's like, how do you evaluate the credentials of someone who is anonymous, right? And who needs to be anonymous, right? If you take a look at MIP 10, it kind of details, you know, what some of those requirements might be. One of the things, for example, is if you are a long-time miner or validator on a large blockchain, you know, you could, for example, sign a message with your private key, right? And that gives now kind of a, you know, gives everyone, right, the social proof that, you know, this person has been, you know, a miner or a validator, you know, in good standing for X amount of time for a blockchain that was securing, you know, X hundreds of millions or billions in value, right? But, you know, we may want to explore other types of metrics as well.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Anyone else have questions on any of the other topics, or pretty much anything at this point? Give it maybe another 5-10 minutes if people have got stuff to talk about. Man, the awkward silences are like harder to endure when you're like the guy is supposed to talk when no one else is talking. Okay. All right. Well, if no one else has anything else to share, I guess we can call the meeting for this week. So thank you to everyone who did a presentation. Thanks everyone for coming. And I guess we will see you all again next week. Richard, recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Long.
Thanks, guys.